Okay, you say go, Chris, and then I'll do the introduction.
Yep, still checking here. But yeah, looks like yep. Yeah, YouTube is live and recordings are on, so we're all ready to go.
Sounds great. I hope the live streaming is working. Welcome, everyone. This is the Colloquium series of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. I'm Nikolaus Kriegeskorte, one of our profs. Today's colloquium is special. We've extended the invite to people across several departments, including philosophy, political science, computer science, neuroscience, journalism, economics, the Knight Institute, and the law school. Our topic really is relevant that broadly. It is social media. Social media have revolutionized human communication. Every one of us can now broadcast opinions and insights to the entire world in an instant. Depending on the likes and shares, our messages can reach millions of people in a very short period of time. And this was initially, rightly, I think, seen as a liberating development, promising more shared experiences, more connected human populations, both nationally and globally, and a more participatory political discourse as well, a kind of global digital public sphere. And also it promised a heightened collective intelligence. After all, we can share our insights and help each other think. So how could that not also collectively lead to better insights and better thinking? I think all of these promises really ought to be very much alive. However, for the past decade, the perils of social media have come to the fore, and rightly or wrongly, social media are increasingly seen as responsible for social isolation rather than connection, various mental health issues, political polarization through filter bubbles and echo chambers, as well as misinformation and disinformation, where the latter refers to messages that have manipulative intent. In other words, rather than connecting us in the right ways, social media seem to isolate us individually and also to isolate us as societal tribes and to polarize our political opinions. And they sometimes seem to bring out our worst impulses and make us lose all civility. Some feel that these negative outcomes are inevitable effects of heightened connectedness, that social media just hold a mirror to us and reveal the ugly truths of human nature. I don't see any reason for this Lord of the Flies kind of fatalism. I think it's not at all clear that the particular social media that dominate today, notably Twitter and Facebook, show us the limits of what's possible. Facebook and Twitter are tech companies that have stumbled upon an initial design and then adjusted it for a decade and a half to increase their profits. What we see today, therefore, tells us little about the inherent limitations of connecting people at a global scale. I think it's time we took on the creative challenge of designing social media in the way they should be designed so as to realize their promise. We should not expect this to be easy. Saying it's like building an airplane would be an understatement. The humanities, the sciences, and engineering all have key roles to play and what is arguably one of the most important intellectual challenges of our time. That's what we're here to discuss today. And I hope today will be the beginning of a multidisciplinary conversation at Columbia and beyond. And our speaker today has some ideas on this. He is Ralf Hertwig. Ralf is a behavioral scientist, a psychologist. He's an expert on judgment and decision-making. He got his PhD from the University of Constance, showing in his thesis that apparent deviations of human judgment from the rational norm of probabilistic inference may be symptoms of a content-sensitive intelligence and thus rational in a bigger sense. I think I first ran into Ralf sometime in the mid-90s in Munich at the Max Planck Institute for Psychological Research, where he was a postdoc and I was then an undergraduate intern. Ralf spent some time at Columbia Psychology as a research fellow in the early 2000s. He then became a professor of psychology in Basel, where he stayed for about a decade. And since 2013, he has been the director of the Center for Adaptive Rationality at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. Ralf's talk today is entitled how behavioral sciences can promote truth, autonomy, and democratic discourse online. Ralph.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nico. I've decided that I think you should be giving the talk. It was a pleasure to listen to you and to your introduction. I think you put it much better than I ever could. So let me try anyhow. So what I would like to talk with you about today is that what behavioral science can contribute to, indeed, promote truth, autonomy, and democratic discourse. This is a pretty great goal, and I will be specifically focusing on mis and disinformation. But of course, the questions, as Nico pointed out, are much bigger and greater. And I would hope that even there, in other issues, behavioral science can help as well. Now, if you follow the if you follow the public discourse, also the academic discourse in, say, the last 10 years, then there's clearly a sense and the opinion that democratic systems across the world are in trouble. And that is, for instance, indicated by books like as this one by Larry Diamond and Mark Plattner, Democracy in Decline, or this very famous book, How Democracies Die, by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Sieglet. And there's also some empirical data. If you, for instance, look at the Global Democracy Index that is published by The Economist every year, then you see that it seems that at least last year, but not just last year, we see somewhat of a rollback of democratic freedoms across the world. And if you look at the map in 2020, you do see that clusters of full democracies, or what we call full democracies, that cluster is actually getting smaller and smaller across the world. And you see a lot of authoritarian regimes and also increasingly a number of flawed democracies. Now, of course, one question that is being discussed in the literature as well is what are the causes for this crisis of democracy and democracy in decline? And there's certainly not a single answer. Different explanations have been proposed, ranging from, for instance, the increasing social inequality in the sense of alienation from the political system, lack of trust in the political system, but also the feeling that perhaps democratic systems are not responding to the global crisis as effectively as you would expect them to do. There is, of course, also another explanation, namely that some of this is being driven by a new information ecology that is very much impacted by social media and the platforms. And I thought I should bring up this person here, Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas is perhaps the most important living philosopher and sociologist in Germany of the second half of the 20th century. And in 1962, he wrote a very influential book that in German was called Strukturwandel der Öffentlichkeit. In English, it was translated as the structural transformation of the public sphere. And in this book, he basically traced the evolution of the public sphere as we have encountered it in the post-war decades. And he was trying to understand the dynamics of public opinion formation, the players in that system. And he also, of course, had normative ideas of how we want to structure that. How do we want to structure and achieve a rational discourse? How do we want to reach an informed pluralism of opinion and rational decision-making? Now, Jürgen Habermas is 92 years old. And as a 92-year-old man, he felt compelled to revisit his work and basically speak of a new structural transformation of the public sphere. I think that is a strong indication that he is very much concerned. He's concerned about the state of the public sphere as we're encountering it now. And I thought I'd tell you a little bit about his thoughts. They are not, if you read them, if you read that paper that was published 2021, they are not that original. I mean, they have been pointed out by other people as well. But I think the really amazing fact is that he, as a very old man, felt really compelled that he has to raise his voice again. So what he's saying in this piece that came out this year was that he's also, like the other experts, observing signs of political regression in democratic system. And his view, and those are his words, this is visible to the naked eye. Everybody can see it. And he does associate much of it also with the different structure of the public sphere, in which now we as readers, as listeners and viewers are empowered to be potential spontaneous authors of content, unlike in the past. He speaks of us as non-responsible potential spontaneous authors. Non-responsible, don't misunderstand that. He's not saying we are irresponsible. We are non-responsible in the sense that our production, our content is not subject to the same kind of filters of quality control that we are accustomed from the past. He also observes, as many other people have as well, that the economic basis of journalism and traditional publishing has widely eroded. And with that, also their gatekeeping function of quality control with regard to the information that enters the public information ecospace. He also points out that, at least in his view, the new digital media are weakly and insufficiently regulated by the political systems. And these platforms are largely absolved from their responsibility for the content that is being spread through the platforms. And last but not least, he kind of argues, he doesn't use the word, but if you read his writing, it sounds like he feels there's a perfect storm, and this perfect storm makes it much harder to establish what he has hoped to be an informed pluralism of opinions, which would empower each of us to form our own opinion, and they can be, of course, conflicting with others. But based on these informed opinions, we would, so his hope, we would make political choices that are as rationally motivated as possible. And he clearly fears that this kind of public sphere and this kind of structure that was in place is increasingly no longer in place. Now, you may agree with him or not, what we did from a behavioral science perspective, he's a philosopher and a sociologist, we have also started thinking about what are the big cognitive challenges that individuals encounter in a digital world. And in this paper that came out last year, we try to outline at least a map of these challenges. This is certainly not an exhaustive map, but I think it hopefully features some of the great challenges. One challenge is clearly the existence of persuasive and manipulative choice architectures. And here what we had in mind were things such as default settings that clearly and regularly intrude our privacy. Also the fact that we are encountering often dark patterns, and dark patterns are basically interface between the platforms and the users that steer user behavior in direction that is often not intended by us, the users, but that serves specific commercial interests. But it's not even clear to us that our behavior is being guided by these dark patterns. Another aspect that, of course, we are very familiar with is AI-assisted information structure, which today means or can mean that we are all seeing different news. That, for instance, the news feed on social media is highly personalized, which means that the information and the news that I see may be very different from the kinds of information that you see. Distractive environments, well, Nico already pointed out that there's a strong business model, and this strong business model basically harvests our attention, our collective and individual attention, and sells it to the highest bidder. And this has consequences because what it means is that the environments are distractive because of the architectural features that they are using. And in this recent paper, which is a meta-analysis across 32 nations, the authors estimated that depending on the classification and the criteria that you use for social media addiction, It's now estimated that between 5 and 25% of users are suffering from some form of social media addiction that also really interferes with their normal life outside of digital media. And last but not least, the widespread occurrence of false and misleading information. And to just give you one illustration of that, the WHO, for instance, has in the context of COVID-related information now spoken of an infodemic, of a tsunami of false information that in fact also interferes with our decision-making, for instance, with our willingness and readiness to follow certain precautionary measures, also, or to accept COVID vaccines. What I would like to do in the next couple of not just minutes in the rest of the talk really, is I will focus on false and misleading information. And I will give you a bit of an introduction as to what behavioral scientists have discussed in order to deal with that problem. And probably at this point, this is the most severe problem of all the challenges in the digital world, at least in terms of the threat to the democratic systems. Now, of course, let's be first very clear that in order to fight false and misinformation, there are many entry points for policy interventions, and behavioral science can only be one of these entry points. What we clearly is also needed are smart regulations, clear ethical guidelines for our individual behavior, but also, of course, for the behavior of the platforms. There's also, of course, as many educational scientists would point out, the need to rethink and revisit the school curricula and implement much stronger emphasis on digital information literacy. And there's also technology itself, which has a responsibility to think about the content and, for instance, think about automated detection of harmful material, or also the ethical design of choice architecture. Think back to the manipulative aspect of the choice architecture that we are encountering in the digital world. And last but not least, we as behavioral scientists, we can also contribute to fighting to providing an answer to these cognitive challenges. I would like in the following to focus on two classes of policy interventions that have been called in the literature nudges and boosts. Nudges, of course, is, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with that concept, and it has been an incredibly influential attempt to bring behavioral science evidence to public policymakers. And I'll talk a little bit about that and give you an idea of what nudging is about. But I will also point to critical issues with regard to nudging and give you some examples of what would that mean in the digital world and in terms of fighting misinformation. And then I will talk about Boost. Boost is an alternative policy approach to nudging. And it is something that I'm very familiar with because we have started to develop and work on it in the Max Planck Institute in Berlin. So I feel I feel more competent to talk about it. So these are the two things that we will touch upon. Nudge approach. Now, originally proposed by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein, and here's the first definition of what a nudge is. In their book in 2008, they defined nudge as any aspect of the external choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any option or significantly changing their economic incentive. Clearly, the innovative part of nudging is really the focus on the external choice architecture. So in a way, you are not even trying to interfere with people's cognition, you try to change their behavior through the choice architecture. Now, more recently, Cass Sunstein, in a recent paper, suggested a classification, two kinds of classes of nudges, what he called architectural nudges, that's the choice architecture. And he gave as examples the automatic enrollment of people into their pension saving funds. Mandatory choice is another change in the choice architecture, or what he calls sludge reduction, which is basically the idea that a lot of processes have friction in them, and if we remove the friction, people are more willing and able to engage with such a process. And he also pointed out that there are educative nudges, and he typically speaks of 3 different kinds of educative nudges, namely warnings, reminders, and disclosure of information. Now, if you think about the conceptual basis of nudging, then you will see that nudging has relatively, you could call it pessimistic. Some people would call it also a rather dark portrayal of our abilities of making good decisions. These are all statements that I've taken from the first 1 or 2 chapters of the 2008 book, in which human decision-making is described as flawed, biased. We are somewhat mindless, passive decision makers. We often make mistakes because we operate in some kind of automatic system, and so on and so on. The image that is being invoked throughout the book is that of Homer Simpson, and the Homer Simpson who's lurking in all of us. Homer Simpson, of course, here standing in for a lot of not so great qualities about humans, such as inertia, prejudice, lack of curiosity, and laziness, and overeating, and many other things. Now, it's perhaps not too surprising that nudge starts with a relatively pessimistic view of human decision-making capabilities, because the conceptual basis of nudging resides in a heuristics and biases program by Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. And this program famously has pointed out that we, by virtue of our cognitive limitations, often fall prey to cognitive illusions and biases by the use of simple heuristics that often lead us astray. So that's the assumption. And because of that, we are not even trying to make people better decision makers. Instead, what we do, we bet on the choice architecture, and the choice architecture, together with our all the problems that we have, they work together and pull us in directions that eventually should be good for us. Let's think about nudging interventions in the context of the digital world, in the context of mis and false information. And let me give you the 2 most discussed examples currently. So these are proposals of how we could deal with some of the misinformation and the sharing of misinformation. One is the use of friction. And friction is actually an architectural feature that already is implemented by Twitter. When you come across a content or a tweet that you would like to retweet, you are asked whether you want to read this before you retweet it. And the logic behind it, the idea behind it, is that if we just ask people to hold on for a second, we create some friction, in other words. Then what people do is that they may not just hold on, but they may start thinking and look more carefully at the content that they are sharing. And the hope is that by so doing, people are less likely to share inaccurate content. Now, I don't know what evidence Twitter has, but there's indeed some evidence that comes from behavioral science, for instance, in a work by Lisa Fascio, who has shown that if we can get people to pause to consider why a headline is true or false, then this can indeed reduce the sharing of false information. Even though I should say that the effects here are not huge, and as they generally are not huge by all these behavioral science interventions, but that may not per se be a problem, because if you think about that, we can scale up these effects across a large population, so that means that even small effects can actually have quite some impact. So that's one kind of nudge intervention, by basically putting in friction into the system. Another one is the work by Gordon Pennycook and David Rand, and they introduced something that they call the accuracy prime, or the accuracy nudge. And the idea here is that basically many people, and there's some evidence for that, many people, actually most people, are concerned about accuracy. They don't want to share false information, but in fact, they want to share accurate information. And we often end up sharing false information because we are not paying enough attention. And that was their starting idea. And basically what they said is then, what if we prime people to keep accuracy in mind? And the way they did it is that they asked people in a non-political context to look at just one headline, such as this headline: woman who had ovary frozen in childhood gave birth to a baby. And people were asked to evaluate the accuracy of that headline, whether they believe it to be right or wrong. And then once they evaluated that, they were then asked to evaluate headlines that had a political content. And what these authors were able to show is that the likelihood of sharing then wrong information decreased. In fact, here's a graph that illustrates that. What you see here is different sources of information, and they are ranked according to fact checkers' trustworthiness rating. And you see in the right top, the New York Times, CNN, Washington Post, and you see ranked to the left, sources such as Breitbart or Daily Caller. And what's plotted here is basically the difference between tweeting from those sources before and after the intervention. And a positive change means that people are more likely to tweet from those sources and a negative means that the likelihood to retweet information from those sources decreases. And basically what you see is that it seems to be the case that after the accuracy nudge, people are more likely to now share information from what the fact checkers consider to be trustworthy sources of information, and are less likely to do that with Breitbart and Daily Caller and other less trustworthy sources of information. Okay, interesting, good, innovative, creative interventions, but there are other critical issues that we should consider when we think about nudging. Let's do that. First of all, and now we are becoming a little bit conceptual for a moment. First of all, if you look into my field, judgment decision-making research, but even more generally in cognitive science, then I think the kind of relatively pessimistic view of human decision-making abilities is not as widely spread as it often appears to be the case, and not as widely accepted as often it seems to be the case. Bounded rationality, which runs through the work of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and also the nudging approach, need not be equated with cognitively flawed software. In fact, if you look closely, then you see that there are influential research programs that actually take a quite different position on that. For instance, in the work by Egon Brunswick, reaching back to the mid of the last century, Ward Edwards, Peterson and Beach, you find the notion of the human mind being an intuitive statistician, being actually really well calibrated to the statistical structure of the world and being able to make good intuitive judgments. In the work by Gary Klein, in the tradition of natural decision makers, he went out of the lab and studied real professional decision makers, so nurses, police officers, soldiers. And what he repeatedly concluded that these people are able to make really good decisions. And they do that was his metaphor, they do that on the basis of a very powerful pattern matching machine that is our brain. We have, when I say we, in particular Gerd Gigerenzer, and I myself have contributed to that, have started a research program on ecological rationality, and that research program tries to show that by notwithstanding the fact that we are cognitively limited, we can use simple decision-making mechanisms, heuristics, that to the extent that they are matched to the informational structure of the world can lead to really surprisingly good performance. And there are many experimental demonstrations of that. And if you, for instance, go into cognitive science, then you find that perhaps the most influential framework today is that of Bayesian rationality. A lot of cognitive, perceptual, and other processes are modeled in terms of the Bayesian framework, where the assumption is that we may not be in quantitative terms Bayesian reasoners, but at least in terms of qualitative features of our reasoning processes, we conform to Bayesian rationality. And what that means is that there's actually a real gap between, or schism within our field, in the sense of how much do we trust human decision-making abilities? And I would argue there are good reasons to not be quite as pessimistic as the nudging approach is. But that's not the only critical issue. There's another critical issue, namely that we should also be very realistic with regard to policy interventions. And that not only refers to nudging, that more generally also refers to behavioral insight more generally. In this recent paper in Econometrica, it was, for instance, reported that the effect sizes of nudge intervention in academic journals is much, much higher than the kind of effect sizes that we find in nudge unit interventions. The difference here between 8.7 percentage points versus 1.4 percentage points. Now, that doesn't mean that nudging is not important or that we shouldn't do it, not at all. It just means let's be realistic, and the effect sizes may not be that amazing to begin with. Another issue that I find very relevant that we should be discussing is how long-lasting is behavior change. And one argument that has been made is that behavior may revert back to the original state once the architectural nudges are being revoked. Once a different policymaker comes along, or once the digital world makes other architectural decisions, the behavior may go back to the original state because there wasn't any intention to actually change the underlying cognition for the behavior. The only goal is to change behavior itself, not the underlying cognition. And there's also an issue that we have paid too little attention, in my view, to the mechanisms underlying nudging. And this is a point that Eric Johnson, a colleague of yours, of course, in this really interesting book of his that just came out, The Elements of Choice, makes very strongly when he argues that it's much more important not just to understand the nudge, but to understand how choice architecture changes choices, because only then we can also predict when a nudge will backfire or will not have the kind of effects that we may hope it has. And last but not least, that's the final point I would like to make, is that I think that nudging, at least with regard to some nudging interventions, takes the risk of respecting and fostering people's agency and autonomy and capabilities too little. Now, all of these concerns have led us, and when I say we, then I mean Till Koenigianov, who is a philosopher, and myself, to also think about an alternative to nudging. And we were really motivated by the fact that there is behavioral science evidence that does suggest that people can be made to be more competent, that our decision-making abilities can be boosted. And that was the starting point of the boost idea. And the conceptual foundation of the boosting idea is indeed in the notion of ecological rationality. So the insight that a lot of our simple cognitive tools that we have can be quite ecologically rational to the extent that they are used in the right context, under the right informational circumstances. And even if they are not used under the right circumstances, we may be able to learn so. And this is just to show that there is a set of books in which we have tried to, and papers in which we have to try to work out this idea in much more detail. Okay, let's talk a little bit about boosting intervention. I'll give you a precise example, and then we talk about how we can apply it to the digital world. And by the way, for those of you who are interested, we just set up a website, The Science of Boosting, which gives much more detail, gives more illustrations, and gives also a bit of account of the research that underlies all of this. So with boosts, what we want to do, we want to target competences rather than immediate behavior. And that's a difference to nudge, because what we want in the end, we want this agency to stay with the decision maker. We can do that, we can boost competences in terms of very domain-specific competences, say financial accounting, but we can also boost domain general competences, such as statistical literacy or digital literacy. And the goal really is, let's preserve agency, let's enable individuals to exercise their own agency. And these boosts need to be transparent to the boosted individual. Otherwise, the boosted individual is not going to be inclined to engage with the boost. And this is a bit of a difference to nudge, where one or the other nudge is often not necessarily transparent to the person who is being nudged. And in general, a boost needs to be easy to understand, easy to remember, and easy to use. Otherwise, it wouldn't have a chance to be used. Okay, so much for the abstract characterization of boosts. Let me give you one boost, and in fact, let me boost you in the next 2 minutes, and just to give you a sense of what a boost could look like. And I'll do that in terms of in a medical domain. And what I want to give you is the boost that helps you to deal with commercial nudging. Because of course, nudging wasn't invented by a behavioral scientist. Nudging has been around forever and is well known in marketing literature and in advertisement and so on. And this is a commercial nudge. What you see here is a real medication. It's called Lipitor. It's being prescribed to fight the risk of stroke, and Lipitor, as the advertisement says here, cuts the risk by nearly half of a stroke. And that is a correct statement. I would say it's also an incomplete statement, and I'll tell you in a minute why, but it's a correct statement. So what it does in patients with type 2 diabetes and at least one other risk factor for heart disease, Lipitor reduces the risk of stroke by 48%. Now that sounds wonderful. That sounds great. If you belong to that risk group, you should take that medication, right? I mean, it sounds very promising. Well, the point here is, no, you shouldn't. You should not that you should not take it. You should think about it. Because first of all, the 48% could mean everything and anything. It could mean in a risk population of 100 people, it could mean a reduction from 100 to 50. That would be wonderful. But 48% could also mean a reduction from, among the 100 people, from 10 to 5. It could also mean a reduction from 1 person to a half person. That all is consistent with 48%. And now you can see in what sense it's a commercial nudge. Of course, by using and speaking of a relative risk, the impression is generated that this has an enormous effect size, an enormous impact. What you should really know is the absolute risk. And the absolute risk needs to be expressed in terms of frequencies. And if you look at the absolute risks, then you see that Lipitor reduces the chance, these are the correct numbers, Lipitor reduces the chance of stroke from 28 in 1,000 to 15 in 1,000. That's a reduction by 13 people in 1,000. And that means that in terms of absolute risk reduction, we're speaking of 1.3%. and not of 48%. I hope I have boosted you because all the boost does is it asks you that whenever you encounter health statistics, and the recommendation actually goes beyond health statistics, you can also apply that in the financial domain. Whenever you are being confronted with health statistics by any healthcare professional, never accept relative risk reduction. Always ask for the relative risk to be translated in absolute numbers and frequencies, such as in this example here. Now, note, please, I'm not telling you to take the medication or not to take the medication. That's not the purpose of this boost. The decision resides with you, unlike in many of the nudging interventions. All I want you to do is to be able to see through these numbers and to make an informed judgment. And it could very well be that you are happy with that effect size and that you decide that you should take the medication, but you should fully understand the numbers. Okay. Now that's the idea of boost. They should be simple, they should be fast, and they should be memorable. What we did here is we came up with it's an incomplete and a preliminary map of boosts for digital literacy. And I will use them in the context of mis and false information, mis and disinformation, but I will only touch upon some examples. I will talk quickly about simple decision aids, about the notion of inoculation, and about a more general notion of deliberate ignorance or critical ignoring. Let's begin with a simple decision aid. Now, a simple decision aid has, for instance, been proposed by Andrew Gass, who is a political scientist from Princeton. And what he did is he came up with a checklist of tips, simple tips that you could use in order to discern between mainstream and false news. And he did that study both in the United States and in India. These are simple tips such as be skeptical of headlines, look closely at the link, investigate the source, watch for unusual formatting. Now, they are not surprising, but they are helpful. Now, Andrew himself points out that the effect sizes are not that great, again, as in many other of the behavioral science interventions, but they work. Now, you may object, and I think that's a fair objection, that this is a little bit too much information and maybe too many tips that we cannot all follow. So what if we just focus on one, namely investigate the source? Now, that exactly was the idea of another intervention that is a boost intervention. And that goes back to the work by Sam Weinberg. Now, Sam Weinberg is an educational scientist from Stanford University, and he came up and created the notion of lateral reading. The starting point of that intervention was he wanted to understand what fact checkers do relative to everybody else. Why are they so good at finding out whether a website is trustworthy, and why are we so bad at it? And if you are interested and want to get more detail, please visit this link on YouTube, where you'll get a lot of an engaging introduction into the work by Sam. Now, what do fact checkers do? The interesting thing is that, unlike us, when they land on an unfamiliar website, the first thing they do is they leave the website. They don't stay on the website. They immediately try to find out who produced that website, and they try to verify whether they can trust that source or not. That's exactly not what the Stanford students and the professors did in the studies that Sam conducted. They tried, and that's understandable, they tried to basically engage with the content and try to figure out, based on the content, whether I can judge whether that's trustworthy or not. They looked, for instance, also at surface graphical features of the website. But that's a really hard thing to do. And let me give you one example. That's an example that Sam has studied. Look at this website. It's the center of the study for the study of carbon dioxide and global change. And the mission statement sounds very reasonable. It says, it was created to disseminate factual reports and sound commentary on new developments in the worldwide scientific quest to determine the climatic and biological consequences of the ongoing rise in the air's carbon dioxide content. Now, engaging with that text and figuring out whether you should trust a website or not is not that easy. It looks professional, it looks serious. What the fact checkers did is the fact checkers immediately left the website and basically Googled who's behind the Center for the Study of Carbon Dioxide and Global Change. And basically what they find is that it's now seen as a front group for the fossil fuel industry. Therefore, you may rightly not necessarily trust the information that's being provided to you. Unfortunately, and that's the starting point of Sam, is that students, but not just students, all of us, professors, are really bad at that kind of evaluation task, because we make the mistake of engaging with the content. And keep in mind, engaging with the content is exactly what the attention merchant wants us to do. They want us to stick to the content, to read it and not leave it. So one boosting intervention would be to exactly teach people that. Be very much aware that it's very hard to figure out based on the content whether you should trust it or not. Here's a different example that leads us to a different class of interventions. And this is work that has started by Steve Lewandowski and Sander van der Linden, and they have contributed much to that work. The idea here is what they call psychological inoculation. And the concept is this. They presume and suggest that we all have a mental immune system. And this mental immune system can also receive vaccines, which are weaker forms of the bad things that can happen to you in the world. And by basically encountering these vaccines, you learn to be more resistant to those strategies and the kind of information in the real world. To give you an example, for instance, and what they did is, they gamified this approach. And for instance, if you play the bad news game, and if you Google it, you can find it immediately. And there are other games such as the Go Viral game, the a cranky uncle game that deals with climate crisis and so on. So what these games do is they introduce you to particular information and to particular strategies that are being applied to you in the digital world. For instance, the use of strong emotions, impersonation, the use of conspiracy theories. And in these games, you have the task basically to convince the other party of false information, to create and convince the other party of false information. And what they find, and there's increasing evidence for that, that by introducing people to those strategies, people are able to see through those strategies and actually in the future become more resistant to those various strategies. So that's a very different idea than Sam's idea, but it's also the idea that we can make people competent by inoculating them, by strengthening their psychological immune system. And what we did is, and I just want to give you a quick example, we used that boosting the idea of inoculation also in the context of political micro-targeting. Micro-targeting, as you are all familiar with probably through the discussion on Cambridge Analytica, is basically, if you will, also a kind of misinformation, because through market targeting, for instance, a political party gets to claim A and gets to claim the opposite. And here's an example from the last German election, federal election. And the example goes back to, it's not scientific work that I'm showing you here. This is the joint production of a German TV personality and Who Targets Me, which is an activist group of people who have crowdsourced a global database of political ads that are placed in social media. So it's not scientifically verified, but the example are serious examples. But what you see here is basically two advertisements by the German Liberal Party. And they have sent these advertisements through Facebook to various groups of people. In the one advertisement, they basically say that we need more climate protection and must meet the climate protection goal. And how do we do that? With a hard measure, namely a clear carbon dioxide limit. This measure can be the game changer in climate protection. At the same time, to other people, they claim not quite the opposite, but essentially something that sounds like very much the opposite, where they basically say, let's have just more fun. Let's invent us out of this crisis rather than prohibit people from doing things that they want to do. And according to their investigations of this group of people, what they found is that the first advertisement is basically directed to people who have a high interest in environmentalism, in organic food, in the World Wildlife Fund, in environmental protection and climate protection. But when they talk to another clientele of theirs, namely frequent traveler, they are using the opposite ad. And the question that you may ask, how can we protect ourselves? This is like what I mentioned earlier. This is the personalized information that we get to see based on our personality features, based on our interests. So what we did is we thought about, can we boost people's ability to see through such micro-targeting? And what we did is that we basically focused on a personality feature that is used in order to micro-target people, namely their degree of extroversion. And we gave people a short questionnaire measuring their extroversion. This is real data, a real questionnaire, and then we gave them feedback on their on their score on this dimension. And this is true feedback. This is not made up or fabricated. This is the feedback based on their answers. And we also describe what extroversion is. What is the concept of this personality dimension? Then we showed to them 10 advertisements. And these advertisements were either targeted to extrovert or introverts. Now, the content is here about cosmetic ads. And I have to say that this is a true limitation. We had to use those ads because this was calibrated material. We are now rolling out that research into the political domain because that's the domain that we are really interested in. But this is an existent proof that we can boost people's ability to see whether they are micro-targeted or not. So we gave them these 10 ads and asked them to please figure out which one is targeted to their personality. And we, of course, also had a control condition where they did something else. And we also did that after in a different condition, we did that. We gave all the information after the detection task and also at a control condition. And basically what we found with that relatively simple boosting intervention, people's ability to distinguish between ads that were targeted at their personality and ads that were not targeted at their personality really improved. In fact, in this existence proof, we were able to show that the mode is now 100%. People are 100% accurate to figure out whether a target was whether an ad was targeted at them. And this was much, much higher than in the control condition where the average performance was only 60%. So in other words, we are able to boost people's ability here to see through micro-targeting. And with that, let me come to the final little illustration. And it brings us to a psychologically, in my view, very fascinating behavior, namely something that we have called deliberate ignorance. Deliberate ignorance is basically the conscious choice not to seek or use information that is somewhat freely available, and we don't do it even though the acquisition costs are low and the potential benefits are large. And we show deliberate ignorance for all kinds of reasons, including emotional regulation, but we also show it in institutional contexts. And I want to give you one example: blind auditioning. Blind auditioning is a form of deliberate ignorance. When we try to select the best candidate, say the best musician, we intentionally blind us and we won't want to see people's gender or people's appearance because we suspect that this kind of information potentially has a biasing impact on our decision-making process. And the point that we made together with Sam Weinberg, the educational scientist from Stanford, is that what we need to be thinking about in the digital world is really a form of the ability to critically ignore. Critically ignoring is an instance of deliberate ignorance, and it means that what typically is taught in schools is critical thinking, right? It's engaging with content, it's working through content. But that's again exactly what the digital world wants us to do, namely engage with content. And very often, and paradoxically, it seems to be the case that in the digital world, we need to critically choose what to ignore, not even to start engaging with the content. Let me give you an example. What is particularly attractive to us is health advice of any sort. Health advice that comes from celebrities like Robert F. Kennedy, or inflammatory false claims, health claims about miracle cures, sponsored content favoring specific medical treatments. These are all examples where basically somebody tries to hijack our attention. And what we need to do here is not critically think about it, but so the argument here, we need to start first with critical ignoring, not even going and looking at that content. And it's something that is demanding, and that is something, but it is something that we can learn. And with that, let me come to the conclusions. What I try to show to you is that I think behavioral science intervention can contribute to dealing with those problems of false information and disinformation. But it can only be part of a multi-pronged approach. And of course, it needs to be implemented by many other things, such as platform governments, robust regulation, digital ethics, and so on. What I would also advocate is a toolbox approach. I'm not here to argue that boosting is better than nudging or nudging is better than boosting. I think we need all kinds of interventions that we can think of. Also because people are different, their cognitive and motivational abilities are different. And because of that, we also need different interventions. And let me come at the very end to the very beginning and ask the question or bring up the question, to what extent are digital media and phenomena on digital media, such as misinformation, false information, to what extent are they associated with the decline of democracy or the threat to democracies? And to what extent are they even causing threats to democracy? That's the important big question that is in the room. And I want to give you just a teaser. We just finished a piece of work just yesterday, actually. And if we had finished it earlier, I would have talked about that, in which we did a large systematic review of causal and correlational evidence worldwide that deals with exactly that question. We identified 500 articles. And if you are interested, I can tell you what we found out about the association, either correlational or causal, between digital media use and a lot of concerning boring phenomena in the democratic system. And with that, I stop here and look very much forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ralph. The floor is open for questions. Please feel free to use the chat or raise your hand virtually to ask questions.
Should I stop sharing, Nico?
Yeah, maybe that's a good idea. Then we can see each other better. So maybe people need a moment. So I'll start. So I'm wondering, we have a variety of good ideas for how to improve social media, but how can they be realized? In what ways should we be working with the tech industry, against the tech industry, or sort of independently alongside building alternative social media?
Well, that's a really big question. I mean, in a more technical way, I would argue that both the boost and the nudge would, of course, benefit from collaborating with the tech industry, because some of these interventions need to be implemented in terms, for instance, of pop-up menus. Or if you think, for instance, of the accuracy nudge, that does require the coordination with, for instance, Twitter or Facebook. So if you want to bring those things to the digital world, there needs to be some kind of collaboration. Now, of course, there's also but that, by the way, we don't need to stop there. A lot of the things that, in terms of boosting, for instance, think of the work by Sam Weinberg, the idea of we need to learn to look at sources. That's something that we can also teach or bring to people in totally different ways. We can do that through flyers, brochures. We can do that through the kind of games that, for instance, Sander van der Linden has invented. And that does require the collaboration of the platforms. But of course, I sense that question. What you are also asking is that whether we have to basically challenge the business model under which the social media are operating. And that is, of course, I mean, that's the big question where as a behavioral scientist, no, as a citizen, I have an opinion. As a behavioral scientist, I cannot necessarily tell you that there speaks evidence for doing that or not. What we can do as behavioral scientists, we can point to the problems that this business model has created and is keep creating. And also, and that brings me to that paper that I could only touch upon at the very end. And there is very disconcerting evidence of at least associations between things such as hatred and hate speech, polarization, misinformation, and the use of digital media. So in other words, we are paying, as societies, we are paying a real price for the business, not for digital media as such, but for the business model that we have come to accept. And that, I think, requires a public debate. Problem, of course, being that no single nation can change the business model of global operating companies, and not even the European Union, which is possibly much more restrictive and critical of that business model than, for instance, the United States. At least that's my current impression. Not even the European Union has, I think at this point, has the power to actually change the business model, even though they can make it much, much harder. So that's a first answer. But I mean, basically, we need to have the debate.
Great, thank you, Ralph. There's 4 more questions. Professor Valerie Purdy-Greenaway.
Hello there. Hello. Just really, really interesting talk. And my question revolves around the nature how you construct these boost interventions. And to give you just a snippet of one of the things that my research is interested in is how do people decide whether research related to diversity, equity, and inclusion and anti-racism is credible. And in that world, it's a world where there are good intentions. The information may not be accurate, but the model that you're using, which is to say, for instance, point out the flaws and show that and tell people that you should focus on, say, absolute values versus relative values, could be problematic in a world in which there's a lot of moralizing. And so maybe this requires an offline conversation, but I'm wondering around heuristics, like when you see an ethnic minority person, or you see a woman in STEM relative to a man talking about the value of DEI, people are diversity, equity, inclusion, people are just more likely to believe it. And so given your logic, the intervention would be, well, don't believe it just because it's a person of color. So I guess what I'm wondering is, and again, if this is a longer conversation or you don't feel like you can address it, I can follow up by email, but I'm just sort of curious how you think about the kinds of interventions and the strategies that you're using in a context that has a lot of like moralizing and good intentions, and your strategy may actually backfire.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I haven't thought about that specific domain. What I did have thought about, and actually all behavioral insights users have to think about, are unintended side effects of these interventions, and they do exist. And they need to be studied as well. They happen interestingly, and one may argue that with boosts, you cannot even imagine that the side effects may occur, but of course they could occur. And we need to, but we have both with regard to nudges and boosts, I think have understudied the potential side effects. Let me point to one side effect that I'm particularly concerned, where I don't know whether there's any evidence available now with regard to nudging. And I'm using that because I've thought more about that. And I don't want to point to nudge. I could also point to boosting, and we very well should have that conversation at a later point. But for instance, one aspect that I'm concerned about is the extent to which nudging makes us unlearn to exercise our agency and to make active choices. Now, if you think about the pandemic, for me, the pandemic was eye-opening in the sense that nearly all the countries in the world, all the nations in the world, were betting on an active, responsible citizen. A citizen who is able to understand risks, a citizen who is able to self-control his impulses, his anxieties, who is able to follow instructions, is able to wash his hands or her hand, is able to wear a mask and do it and keep doing it and wear it correctly. So what I'm wondering is that if we, and that's the danger that I sometimes thought about in the context of Corona, if we come to believe only in the choice architecture, and at the same, and as important as choice architecture is, and I see Eric is sitting in front of me, and he has made that very strongly in his book. But as important as that is, it's also important to exercise agency and to experience you being an active chooser. And I think that the big problems that we are facing in the world, including climate change and the pandemic and other things, do require a responsible, active citizen. And we need to train that. We need to practice that. And that is, for me, one of the potential side effects, that if we were only betting on choice architecture and matching.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great. So there are 4 more questions. We are almost out of time, so maybe we can go through them quickly and then dig deeper in the private discussion, where I hope many of you will join. So let's have the next question from Michael Woodford from the Department of Economics at Columbia.
Yes, thanks. I enjoyed the presentation a lot. I think that this is a fascinating program, and the boosting techniques are likely to be very valuable. But I wonder if they can be a complete solution to the problems that you started with. It seems that the idea is based on people wanting themselves not to cooperate in the problematic kinds of behavior. And so if you give them tools to understand better what they're doing, you can solve the problem. But one of the things you started the talk with was the problem of political polarization and threats to democracy. And I wonder if in these cases, it isn't often the case that individuals don't have a strong motivation to do the things that make the system as a whole function well. I mean, so in the case of political polarization, it may be that individuals enjoy having their party win. They enjoy making fun of people who are, political opponents of theirs and so on. And it may be that they simply don't have the individual motive to behave in a different way that would avoid these threats to the functioning of the democratic system.
Yeah, I think you raise a very valuable and fair point. I think another way of thinking about that point is that there's huge heterogeneity in motivations and also in preferences and cognitive abilities. And I acknowledge that. And it may very well be the case that boosts are not being adopted by certain groups of people for all kinds of reasons. That's one of the reasons why I think that we need a toolbox of interventions. And it could well be that some of the nudging interventions don't require as much cognitive motivation and cognition as the boost require, and they may be better suited to reach these people. Having said that, let me also point out that there is clear evidence, for instance, that in terms of sharing false information, a lot of the sharing of false information is, for instance, done by older people. And we don't know exactly why. And it's not clear at all that they want to share wrong information because they don't care, because they want to be provocative or whatever. There could be totally other motives, namely that, for instance, they don't see through the falsity of the information, or they think, oh, this is strange, and they send it off to their kids because that's a way to get into contact with their kids, to talk to them over something interesting. So, and it could well be that these are well-meaning people who have an accuracy motivation, but they, in the moment when they share the information, they don't understand exactly that they are sharing false information. So it could be that, and for instance, there's an estimate that 80% of false information is being shared by people who are 65 and older. So it could well be, if we reach that population, and this population has a motivation and has an accuracy concern, that we are undoing much of the damage that is currently being done. So in other words, that issue is still open. Which of these interventions will really have large effects? But in principle, I totally take your point. I think that's a very fair point. But I think we need also more evidence, and we need to better understand which interventions maps on which kind of people in a digital ecosphere.
Let's take another question from Ben Silver.
I think Niall had his hand raised before me. If you want to go first now, I don't want to jump the line.
Sure. Niall,
Okay.
go ahead.
All right. Okay. I'll try and be quick. Really nice talk. And I wanted to bring up this issue of the incentives that these businesses have for doing this. I think they are very, very powerful. That I don't believe that they are going to give up using these techniques to get us to keep clicking without some kind of laws. And that's just my own opinion. I mean, it might be shamed into it, but I have my doubts. So I think politicians are going to have to get involved. And you mentioned how in the EU, where, I think it's a better chance than over here in the US, that you'll get action, but there still isn't any action. Perhaps I think the work that you and others, this great work, will help bring that about. But when I look at this United States situation, I see politicians with very strong interests not to regulate this because they're benefiting so much. And all they have to do is essentially stonewall. The arguments will come, they'll come up with misleading counter arguments, and they will prevent legislation that I think is needed from being enacted. Have you thought at all about this and how particularly, well, I mean, I'm living in the United States, how this could possibly be handled?
Yeah, we have actually thought quite a bit about it. In fact, Steve Lewandowski, who was popping up in a lot of the work that I presented here, he spent a lot of time also at the Max Planck Institute with us. And he, with some of us, has spearheaded a report to the Joint Research Center of the European Union. And I'm very happy to share that report that we've written. It's entitled Technology and Democracy. And in that report, we are basically using behavioral science, try to analyze exactly the consequences of this business model. And we also suggest ways to remedy it. And of course, one intervention, one serious measure would be to seriously think about the business model. And this report has been brought to the North. It actually was written for the Commission, for the EU Commission. And so they are fully aware of the recommendations that we put in that report. And it also has already some impact. But I also, at the same time, having said that, and by the way, let me know if you want to see that report. It's publicly available. I'm more than happy to share it. I think it's turned out to be a really interesting piece. But I also want to be realistic. Of course, it is totally true what you said. There are very strong economic interests, and these are globally organized huge companies. And it will be extremely hard, even for such a strong political entity such as the European Union and the Commission, to change the business model. I mean, one of the things that we also touched upon is the idea that maybe we, the European Union, should invest money into creating its own digital media and social platform, a platform that is not organized according to that business model, but for instance, that would be a totally different model, that basically we all as users pay a certain subscription. And as in exchange, what we get is that our data on us is not being used and sold off to other companies. That would be a totally different business model, almost like a utility, as we also serving public good purpose. Now, this is an ongoing discussion at least in the public European discourse. But as you know, the European Union doesn't tend to rush to decisions and to measures. So I don't know how that's going to unfold. But if you read that report, you will find ideas such as that in that report.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Last question, Ben Silver.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk. Super interesting. So my question is about like an implicit assumption that I think is in a lot of this research, which is that, you know, when we think about the relationship between cognition and the internet or social media, I think we assume that it's just yet another medium for these same age-old biases and heuristics to play out. And what I don't see as much is almost like a cohort effect, right? How are these tools actually altering our behaviors, whether that's just in a comparative way? So how do we like actually act differently online from how we act offline? Or how is, you know, global access to the internet affecting our behavior writ large, both online and offline? So I'm just wondering how you bring this consideration into your research, if you think it's an important one, an overlooked one, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that you are raising a very important question. And it's one that we touched upon in that paper that I pointed you to that was published in 2020. Psychological sign in the public interest, because there we have a long discussion about what is really different between the offline and online world? And we point to a number of differences, such as, for instance, I mean, the very fact that if you, and Nico mentioned that earlier, that at your fingertip, you can reach a huge audience, which of course in offline communication is typically not possible. But what we also concluded in that discussion is that it's actually increasingly hard to speak of a clear separation between online and offline worlds, because typically we often now live in worlds that include both components. We live in a hybrid world. And that, of course, also raises totally new questions. But also what I would think is that the call is still out to what extent our cognition and our decision-making strategies and the way we arrive at decision and search for information, whether that's qualitatively very different in the offline world than in the online world. And if so, what does that also mean for the kind of policy interventions that we are thinking about? That's still one of the great, wonderful questions that we as behavioral scientists could ask.
Wonderful. Let's thank Ralph again. And we'll reassemble in the discussion room, let's say in 4 minutes. See many of you there, I hope.